Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Circling into Dialogos, and in this case, the reunion of the band of the original Dialogos conversations with Jordan Hall, Christopher, John Vervaeke, and myself. It's been over a year since the four of us have gotten back together, so I'm excited for this conversation. Which also parallels with me being absent for a while. So I apologize, I have not put out very much content in the last, 6-8 months or so. I have personally been dealing with some personal health things and some health things going on in my family, and just responding to all of that and trying to get all of that right. I think I'm on the other side of it, and I'm feeling a lot better. And so there is more conversations that I've already done that I'm going to be uploading soon, and much more to come. But I'm super excited for this conversation. So before I go into that, I want to first cover with you some housekeeping. So if you are interested in circling and you want to dive deeper in that, you can do that by going to the Circling Institute website. All the links are below in the show notes. We do have the Art of Circling, which is the main course that we do, which is a facilitators and practitioners training program to dive deep into the practice. That's happening in November, and the course is filling up. So if you've been thinking about it and you've just been putting off like registering or looking into enrolling into it, I would do that pretty quickly, because we're starting to fill up here. We have every Thursday we have an open circling event, 6 to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Everything's on Zoom. We have weekend intensives, and so much more. Also, if you're interested in working with me one-on-one, go ahead and email me at guysengstock@gmail.com, and just let me know that you're interested, and then we'll take it from there. All right. This conversation was very much like our previous conversations. We got into Dialogos pretty much right away, and it felt to me like what we discussed, which I'm going to have to listen to it again to really, I think, grok the fullness of it, because it was so multidimensional and multi-layered, is at the heart of what we're kind of going through as a culture. And I think you could say what most individuals are going through, and how to specifically the fundamental importance of correct orientation, real orientation, right? That brings in the verticality of being, right? And the horizon of time, that those things aren't split, but they come together in a mutually affording, self-transcending way that shows up as a meaningful world for us. We go deep into that, and so I hope you really savor this conversation. I certainly did, and this will be the first of a series of, and probably a number of them, that we'll be doing together in the future. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conversation.
So I think we are up against the phenomena of orientation in Stegmeyer's sense, and I've been trying to do a lot of work around that in connection with the Chino conference, which is about this little corner of the internet. Trying to be more self-reflective, self-aware, the notion of home and homing. But what's coming out in the course that I'm doing for Halkian, and some of the critiques and critiques of the critiques, is that orientation seems to be bound up with finding the intersection between the horizontal and the vertical dimensions. If you only have the horizontal, you're adrift, and if you only have the vertical, you're stuck. And so orientation should afford you to move, but to move in a non-drifting way, where I mean drifting in the disoriented sense, not in the sense of we're off for a wonderful day in the park or something like that. And to me, this brings up something perennial, but also something pertinent. I won't go into the depths of this, but Rosen's critique of Wittgenstein and Heidegger was that they both mismanaged the relationship between dianoia, which is the discursive unfolding of the horizontal, and noesis, which is the contemplative realization of the vertical, and how they have to be held in proper relation. Or if you want, the cataphatic and the apophatic. There's lots of different names for the need to keep these two properly integrated in order to properly orient. And of course, this is all relevant to the more formal theoretical work that's going into dialectic, into Dialogos, because we invoke, and Chris and I have done it even in explicit writing, the vertical and horizontal dimensions to try and articulate what's going on in dialectic into Dialogos, and how it is properly and exercise that leads into a process that orients us, that puts us in right relationship, that binds us to a navigation and a way of moving forward. And so I think I'm very much being persuaded by Rosen's argument that nihilism occurs. I want to be careful. I want to be fair to Rosen. There are many reasons for nihilism. One is the breakdown of the two worlds mythology and things like that. But one of the ways this shows up is a loss of logos, of ratio, a proper proportioning between the horizontal and the vertical. And part of that is both Wittgenstein and Heidegger seem to be arguing that the only way of appropriating, understanding the vertical is the two worlds mythology, and the two worlds mythology must be rejected because it leads to nihilism. And then Rosen's point in response to that is, yes, but when you lose the vertical, the horizontal becomes untethered and it becomes disoriented. And right, so he has a wonderful way of saying this. Noesis without dianoia is empty silence, because it's silence that can't impregnate speech. And dianoia without noesis is empty chatter. It's speech that can't be impregnated by silence. And so I want to put that constellation of things, the vertical and the horizontal, noetic silence, contemplative realization, dianoia, horizontal speech, right? And put them and see what we can do about how do we regather them together, find the logos between them, because this is a presupposition behind all of the work Guy and Chris we're doing on dialectic, that there are these two dimensions and that they have a proper way of relating that puts us into proper relating, that orients us to the world and binds us to the world in the right way. I want to get, and so now I'm going to put this in a question after all of that preamble, because I want all of that preamble in this question. How do we properly relate? How do we properly proportion and appropriate the vertical and the horizontal in the way I've described beyond the two worlds mythology? And two worlds mythology means neither inverting it the way that Nietzsche did or trying to merely negate it, because negating it is to accept the presupposition that the only way of apprehending the vertical is with the two worlds mythology. How can we do that beyond the two worlds mythology, which is neither merely inverting it nor negating it? That's my question, and I'd like us to pursue it, because for me, this is becoming a fundamental, and I mean this in a deep sense, philosophical problem at the heart of dialectic into Dialogos.
Yeah. Just to before we dive in, but to highlight like even what we're inside of right now, I'm kind of getting more of a sense of like my sense of, we were talking about this before I hit record about what we want to talk about, which was like kind of like, well, well, why were we coming back together? And in that whole conversation, I remembered one of the reasons I wanted us to start talking again, right, was a sense of the sense of the feedback I've gotten from people, what the four or five conversations that we've had before served for them. And I think this starts to speak to what the very thing that you're talking about, in that of all the videos that I've ever made, anyways, I have never gotten more feedback about people talking about that they've come back and listened to it over and over and over again. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something, and that for a lot of people experienced it as an inspiring kind of source for what is at the bottom of that was at, that all the different channels that started around this, the thing that we call this corner of the internet, whatever this is, that there's a gathering around, that there was something that I think for people that sense that what we were all doing together exemplified something that they kept returning to and wanting more of, right? And that, and my sense was that, well, why did they go back to the conversation, which is rare, like these days, that people kind of like, they're usually going to the next conversation because there's 8,000 more that are new, but they kind of, it's a rare thing that I hear, like going back and listening to a conversation that's old. And I've so many people have said that. And I'm wondering if part of what the Dialogos is, the way it's presencing is precisely presencing, right, in an eminent way, the inexhaustible fount,
yes.
Right?
Yes. Vertical.
Where these two things are coming together. We're not solving any final thing, right? We're revealing more of what is, that is also showing what is beyond it, right? Which is having us reveal more, and that this has been a kind of Dialogos this is what we've been talking about, is an enactment of that, the very structure of our being.
And I think that's right.
Yeah.
And I think this, the fact that we in a very real way, we're proposing a kind of flowing insight into orientation, I think is crucial. Now, but there's a tension in this little corner. And there's a tension between those who see the need for the intersection, we'll put it neutrally, I guess, between the vertical and the horizontal, but they feel that is necessarily, they accept Heidegger's presupposition, that's necessarily bound up with the two worlds mythology. And then there are other people in this corner who say, no, we have to break out of the two worlds mythology. And what's even interesting is you can see that tension even within somebody who's religiously oriented. And I don't mean this in a negative sense. Like when we're talking with Bishop Maximus, he really profoundly appreciates the work I'm doing to try and overcome the two worlds mythology and recapture the vertical. But yet he still feels called to the tradition. And I really honor him for this. He walks right to the horizon, right, of that, and he's playing with it. But so again, we're not authorities for this little corner, but I think I feel responsible for at least explicating and trying to articulate that tension and taking an existential stance towards it, because these are existential questions, right? Orientation is an existential question. You can't answer it other than in a perspectival and a participatory way. And so I would like us to do what we have done. I'd like us to, I'm open to emergence. I mean, I have ideas and arguments, but I really want to follow the logos on this about like it. Well, I've posed the question and I'll shut up. I want to, and I think all I wanted to say was, I think I'm agreeing with you, Guy. I think the question is a way of trying to explicate and articulate both a comportment within this corner of the internet, but I was also add a tension in it. I think a creative tension, a tonos, but yes.
So I want to name just a couple things to maybe get this going. So the two dimensions, the vertical and the horizontal. When I think about what about these dialogues works, is that they have a narrative structure that is spontaneous. And that narrative structure that's spontaneous and unpremeditated opens into something approximating a vertical insight. And that you can't, when I reflect back on them, I realized that the vertical insight, the thing that has suddenly gathered and concentrated our attention on the thing that is prevailing above us at that moment, could not have been attained without the narrative structure that actually gathered the context first.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? We've talked a lot about how in this exercise, in these practices, there is a kind of theatrical component. There's a dramatic component. And I think that the more time that goes on and the more we do this, both informally when we fall into it and formally when we structure it, I have this hunch that the thing that consistently gathers people to it, the thing that adheres people together, is the narrative structure that emerges in the relationships as they're developing in real time. That the development of the relationships, right? The development of the relationships between us, which in effect took place in real time, live, so to speak, became inseparable from the emergence of the insight or insights or series of insights and the orientation. I was thinking about one of the things that I find difficult to come by in the little corner, but now it's starting to actually become easier, which is that, you know, there are these sort of two kinds of friendships you can have. Well, there are many kinds, but two of them, you know, roughly are sort of like this. One is, you know someone for many, 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 many years, and you see them regularly or semi-regularly. And there's a kind of coasting across time. And you have a lot of shared history. There are so many events that you have in common that you can return to. You have memories together, and those memories anchor the relationship and give it texture, and they give it significance. Even if you can't talk in depth with one another, that shared history together gives you a co-orientation that you can return to, and that becomes the foundation of the relationship itself. That has independent value, even if it's missing all kinds of other things. And then you have relationships, which I think are becoming more common, or at least began as more common in this little corner, which is that you drop into a room with someone with no shared history. You steep in this deep penetration of place and awareness of ideas. And a world opens between you, and that world is based on that momentary opening. But you don't have all of that shared history. You don't have events. You don't have times when your bodies have co-regulated to one another in space, in adventures, in hardships and sufferings. You don't have all of that. But what you do have is this powerful sense of presence that you're opening to. And we're obviously, what you do, Guy, especially, and what we're all doing is trying to tutor the opening and to tutor the receptivity to what occurs just in that moment. But it occurs to me that neither of those two on their own, like when I think of the most powerful, formidable relationships that I can recall, they have both. They have the events and the memory creation that anchors the horizontal dimension and gives a place to return to, a place to go back where you've saved the game, you know? But then they have that training where you look in that horizontal landscape as it's unfolding. You also have the topography, you have the relief, you actually have scale. So you know, in other words, you have kairos, you hit a point in the unfolding of time and history where you begin to sense, here's where we go vertical. And then when those two roll together really well, like when you really attune to somebody, and I think this happens with couples, you know, really profound relationships, you begin to ritualize the ways in which those two things intersect. We go here together on this adventure so that we open to verticality. We go travel together, and the travel brings romance, and that romance brings disclosure, and that disclosure brings intimacy, and that intimacy feeds back into the memories we've already made and reorients us to the relationship itself. And suddenly the relationship is growing on both axes. This is all to say that I think one of the things that we're trying to do within the dialectic and the dialogos in a single instance of it is really what we're trying to do across time, which is that the building of the relationships is also building the capacity for those kairotic moments when they can go vertical, and that to deprive them of either one of those dimensions is to deprive them of a necessary condition they need to thrive. Now, that doesn't deal with maybe like the ontology of the two worlds mythology, but I wanted us to begin to talk about the two dimensions just in the relational container, because that's actually what we're doing at this moment before feeding it into something a little bit loftier. Anyway, I want us to see how that lands with you guys.
I think that's a great explication of the fact that the phenomenology, and I don't just mean experience, I mean of intelligibility in the practice, is precisely that interdependence of the historical, horizontal, and the vertical. And I lack a word because we don't have a discipline associated with the vertical anymore. I sort of fall back on contemplative. It isn't quite right. Yeah.
I really, yeah,
Go ahead.
Well, I want to make sure there was some really interesting faces that Jordan made that I didn't have the subtitles, so I want a different way.
I lost a few of them, but they'll come back. It's getting like the thing is getting thicker, right? The material is building itself. So one thing that came with enough clarity, maybe two, that seemed like they would move things in the right direction. One is to remember the historical moment, particularly in relationship to things like disorientation. So when we come into a particular context where, for example, we don't have a framework, we don't have a plan, we don't have an obvious raison d'etre, we don't have an obvious method for how one goes about resolving the aforementioned lack. You enter into a sort of nakedness of disorientation, and the big piece of the historical moment we're in is that that's the nature of where we are, meaning we're, as a species, moving into a place where the frameworks and plans and techniques and methodologies that have brought us here are in many cases not going to avail to move us forward. And so we have to actually become extremely comfortable simultaneously with the shedding of those, moving into the deep disorientation that is intrinsic in that, and then finding perhaps the deeper basis of how one becomes oriented, let's say in general, and become quite comfortable in operating in that fashion. So that this links, by the way, Guy, to sort of all the way back to one of the first things you brought in, which is maybe what's going on and why might somebody choose to watch this again and again. And very little to do with, I think, the content of specifically what's said, but rather the ability to embody the happening of the style of orientation in a new, what is in fact perhaps a new mode, and a mode that is, okay, flicking it back up here, by the way, vertically, Chris, you're vertical for me. If I do that, I'm talking about you. Chris is the horizontal and the vertical, but the two worlds mythology is one framework that we're losing all of them. We're losing so many of them, maybe all of them, I don't know, but certainly so many of them. So the constitution. So we're actually in the process of actually gathering things like, how does one do a boot P if you're an old school computational person, like coming from very, very, very low level communications and being able to actually engage in a bootstrap protocol to increase the robustness, by the way, the bespoke robustness of the horizontal dimension. And then, of course, what is the universal practice of the vertical that doesn't need to be named, although we can throw names at it and they'll stick for a couple of epochs before they get thrown away.
That what you just did was really interesting. So I guess I want to ask you, Jordan, in specific. I mean, we tried this thing where we gave up the vertical and we thought we could find it in the horizontal, and that's a utopic mode, right? So what we'll do is we'll take the vertical and we stick the axis mundi into the future, and that's how we're oriented, and that's the myth of progress, and that's largely collapsed. So I see that, and I see the two worlds mythology as being the two ways in which we've tried to deal with the vertical. You indicated you think there are others. It might help if you could articulate some of the other ways in which people have tried to frame the vertical and relationship to the horizontal. Because perhaps if we looked at all of them, we might find a shared presupposition that we could call into question.
Well, okay, before that, not just because it happens to be slippery, I'll lose it, is to also maybe presence the dimension that would be orthogonal to the plus sign that we're identifying.
Yeah.
Which is the experiential, right? The moment itself, the not the one that is looking at and thinking about, but is participating in. Of course, all of us are here in that. So let's be mindful of that. That there's something going on that doesn't need to be described or named. That if we can actually simply practice it with real curiosity and with a certain level of adeptness, it explains itself by virtue of its presence and its practice, and we can tag it later, something like that. Okay, so tags that we have seen. I'll go with, for example, the experience of a musician, musician who is playing freestyle, right? And there's something about the feeling of the impeccability of the way that the notes flow one after the other. John, I think you and I talked about this yesterday.
Yeah, that's good.
There's something that is coming from the thing that we can call the vertical, and it is manifesting itself quite skillfully in the articulation in the horizontal, which of course is the expression of musicality in time, that doesn't partake of any framework of a two worlds mythology. It has a different sensibility and a different lineage altogether. I might even say an older one. I really am quite careful about the historicity of it. So that's an example. We could do the same thing with all the forms of art. Every artist that has ever done any form of art has some particular, sometimes it's part of a school or a practice, sometimes idiosyncratic of how it is that they are in relationship with that which is expressing itself through them, and they as the instrumentality of the articulation of that expression in the materiality of reality that can be shared more broadly than their interior.
Those are good. That's helpful. So I like the musicality where you have sort of something like vertical. Rusin has unpacked this. We have sort of vertical harmony, and you have horizontal melody, and they're completely interpenetrating without invoking a two worlds. That's good. And then I heard sort of a broader invocation of something like code and signal, right? There's code, which is vertical, and then there's signal, which is the actualization of the possibilities that are vertically held in the code and that come out. So I thank you. I thought if we had a bunch of these to play with, we could have some flexibility around it, because the question I posed to all of you was presupposing that we could get some flexibility. And I want to enact what you were just saying, Jordan. I want to try and get us enacting it, playing with it, having multiple ways of invoking it and talking about it, multiple metaphors, so that we might find a deeper through line. So what for the three of you, what comes if we put all those side by side? I'm not talking about a logical resolution. I'm talking about what starts to stand out from all of them. We've got the two worlds, we've got the utopia, we've got the music, the musicality, and we've got code and signal within sort of information. What's resonating, what's coming out, what's emerging from placing them all in juxtaposition to each other? Anything?
You know, one of the one is a sense of a paradox, and specifically, Chris, when you were talking about that sense in which this accumulated shared history becomes significant in and of itself, right? That I don't need to have like deep connections with you, right? If I accumulate this history, just that in itself stands as something kind of is the vertical axis, right? It kind of, in some sense, accumulates out of time and then jumps up as the thing. And what's interesting to me is that when I think about like the ultimate form of that, it's family, right? So family, it goes back generation, right? Like heaven knows, like just look at your own family. Like they're not necessarily people that you would necessarily hang out with, right? But you most likely do, or feel obligated to do, or something like that. But there's something things I've noticed like within in teaching people how to circle, which is teaching people basically to kind of open up into the vertical dimension through the horizontal intimacy, is that the toughest place to do it is actually with people in which I have that shared history with. right?
Mhm.
Like, because it's like there's something like, I think the sense is like, well, if I open up, which is always a risk, right? To like, who are you really? Not who are you with this thing that I shared, and not everything that I know, but actually, what is that inexhaustible thing that I can't conclude about you? If I, well, how about we feel it together? In that moment, right? There's a risk in some sense, right? So I just noticed there, right? I just noticed there that when there's a lot at stake, this sense of risking to open up into the vertical, right? People
Right.
will experience that in terms of their family and their close friends. They have the hardest time bringing what they're learning, for example, encircling into those relationships because so much is at stake, right?
So I want us to ask the question of what's at stake, because there's something really powerful underneath this. I love that it's kind of synchronistic that you brought up that example guy, because I was actually thinking of something very concrete, which is that I recently got back in touch in a meaningful way with a cousin of mine who I haven't had a relationship with properly since we were 12 years old.
Mhm.
And what I find so fascinating is that they're sort of getting to know each other completely de novo, like as though from scratch. And yet, even though those years of getting together once a year, embedded in the familial context, even though there was no deep and profound intelligible content shared between us, that something accrued over that time. Something is there. It wasn't for naught. It wasn't incidental. There's something that was gathering together, but it's gathering together under layers of sediment, and it's revealing under those layers of sediment threatens something. What is the thing that is threatened?
Yes.
Because if the thing that we prioritize as being most profound and real is that contemplative verticality that bridges us into a domain of ideas, if it's not the incidental events and histories, then it's leaving something very important out of the story. It's leaving something far more embodied and visceral and something of the gut. It leaves it out of the picture. So this is I think this is a fulcral question somehow that I don't know, and I don't know why, but what is the danger of speaking forth something that will risk changing the significance of all of those years of history? And if that changes, what else changes? What is that danger?
Well, the thing that popped immediately to my mind when you said that was the subtle labyrinths with which you have veiled your heart. These things that were laid down in those early days in ways that were deep and fundamental, and also very difficult to remember or protect, because the future you was on the basis of those, right? But they're embedded in those relationships. And somebody who knew you when you were 12 saw you before you were particularly good at putting on your costume. And there's a way that they will look back at you with the eyes that saw you then that can't be avoided now. And so the part of you that protects yourself maybe feels the vulnerability that is simply implicit in that relationship, a vulnerability that you can't avoid because the avoiding was done later. Do you understand my meaning?
Yeah. I think that strikes me as exactly right. And the thing that is most vulnerable in the vulnerability to me has something to do with what is not yet in the bounds of my attention. What I'm really threatened with, in some sense, is that there is something that was always already true about me that hasn't been revealed to me, that can only be revealed by getting back in touch with the lower stories. Jung has this interesting metaphor about the lower stories and the higher stories, and that the modern person has somehow lost contact with the lower stories. And he means it in both meanings. He means it like the stories of a building and the stories of mythology and narrative, and that we're somehow fixed into the sky above the clouds without contact to what came before. And he means it in both ways. He means it narratively, mythologically, and also contemplatively. And somehow not knowing what's below in those lower stories means that the revealing of those lower stories threatens everything that's at the crown of the tree, everything that protrudes.
So I'm hearing something here. A couple of things. One is there seems to be some non-logical identity between the vertical depth something has and also the depth of the history that it's come from. There's some relationship there, right? There's some deep this way and deep this way, and they have this identity relationship in some fashion, such that one can challenge and disrupt the other. They're interlocked. That's what I'm hearing coming out of this. Something from the depths can rewrite my history, and my history can disturb my depths. That's what I heard you saying, Chris. So it sounds
100%.
Okay. So that's really interesting, because both of those are experiences of disorientation, right? So there's the way in which the deep, the temporal deep and the eternal deep, I'll speak in Jungian terms here now, right? They're locked in an identity relation, obviously not logical identity, right? They're locked, and they, right? They can profoundly disrupt each other, but that speaks to the possibility of the other, which is they can profoundly, right, afford each other and affine to each other, which would be the opposite of disorientation, I take it, but something like a proper orientation. Is that landing for you, what you said, Chris?
Yeah, I think it lands beautifully. And I'll say one more thing, which it sort of brings up, is I'm tempted to think of the two dimensions. I'm tempted to personify them, in order to better understand their relationship. And I'm thinking of the moment, like, I wonder if you guys have had this moment with someone that you've known a very long time, but have had a relatively flat relationship with. And you're with this person and you're spending time, and there's this call from the vertical to presence it, right? It's like we've known each other for so long and we've never gone here. And I almost feel there's this nascent awareness of that fact between the two people, and one might be more conscious of it than the other. Maybe it's unconscious for one, but I feel it's there, and I feel it's a kind of unanswered question, or maybe even an unasked question. And over the history, that question becomes a little bit more audible and a little bit more audible and a little bit more audible. I don't think the history is agnostic to the verticality. I think
or vice versa, right?
Or vice versa. And so I feel as though the vertical sometimes is a voice that's trying to intercede tacitly and say, okay, you've done this for a while now. It's time. You got to break the surface now. And you can either say yes or not.
So like, I guess, coming back to the question, what if I break it? Right? What is the sense of what am I risking? Right? Back to your question, what's at stake here? Right? Like, if we go there and we find out that we can't, or it goes badly, or whatever it is that attenuates with that risk, is it the idea that my whole history together was actually revealed as false and baseless? And therefore I don't want to find that out, or I don't want to know that, or I want to get the sense of this. I'm here implicitly, this presence of something's really at stake.
But you're going to hit aporia, right? You're going to get disoriented. You can't move forward now because the continuity of the history has been shattered, or you can't move up and down because the continuity between the levels has been shattered. Yeah. To use a Jungian thing, the unconscious and the conscious are not talking to each other. Or to use a Platonic, right? The conscious is not in communication with the transcendent, right? You get it. So when they disrupt each other, I think you can get aporia, and the aporia can either land in. I think there's three possibilities. The aporia can land vertically, and we can feel that we're in a flat world, a superficial world. The aporia can land horizontally, and we feel like we're in a world in which there is no future for us. Or it can do both, in which reality is properly absurd to us, right, in a profound way. And so nobody wants aporia, and I think there's an intuitive sense of if we go this way, we might hit aporia. And I think part of the question that emerges in that existential fashion that Chris is, there's some sort of intuitive sense that, hey, the horizontal and the vertical are starting to disrupt each other rather than support each other. And if we don't address this, we're going to fall into disorientation. And I mean, we have different we can do the retelling of the history, or we can do the recoding of the ascent and descent, right? And we can play with recoding and retelling. But I think that what you're asking for, Guy, and what Gordon keeps bringing us back to is, what do we do when we're in that radical aporia, where right, the way the horizontal deep and the vertical deep need to talk to each other. And this is Rosen's critique, that Wittgenstein and Heidegger don't realize how much they need to be in dialogue together. Right? The Wittgenstein of the Tractatus throws away speech for the silence of the latter, and the Wittgenstein of the investigation throws away the vertical and launches us into endless chatter, because there's nothing other than that guides us. So this to me is, I'm starting to get very excited about this, because this for me is opening up, like, what is it that we have taken it that aporia has a proper place in Dialogos, and this is the Socratic thing. And so somehow aporia and disorientation are important in this relationship. Like this aporia is like the most fundamental frame breaking, because it's breaking how the vertical and the horizontal, it's taking their ability to disrupt each other and using it to smash everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Why is that? Like, and we've all, and I'm not backing out of this. I agree. We've all said with Socrates, getting people there is a good thing. And so why?
Right. Yeah,
why is it good to get to aporia? Is that what you meant? Is that the question, John?
Well, I'm saying if we could understand aporia in this deeper way, right, as this disorientation, because the vertical and the horizontal they're deeply interlocked, and they can deeply disrupt or deeply avail each other, right? And what happens in aporia is the mutual disruption is taken to an extreme, and we get all three dimensions of disorientation. Why is that a good thing?
Okay, so the feeling I was having was extremely physical. In fact, so physical, I couldn't figure it out. So the first step was it had the feeling of like when you've had food poisoning, and you're moving
really good, actually.
With the point, it's like there's something toxic that your system is noticing, and at first it's a subtle noticing, because here's the thing: the consequences of throwing up and diarrheaing violently for hours are not pleasant, right? You don't want to go there. That's not where you want to go. And at first your body's going, oh man, something's wrong here, right? You got kind of a queasy feeling going on, a little bit of your temperature starts to fluctuate. You get cold sweats, right? There's subtle, but not so subtle symptoms of something going on. And then you cross the threshold, you come up to that moment, and you just fucking cross it. Of course, it's a participatory crossing. It's a one-way trip. And then you go through a purging process, right? The whole mechanism of going through whatever needs to be gone through to exit the toxic and make the changes in the interior that need to be made to return to health, which is an unpleasant journey, right? The whole journey is unpleasant. And then the second one, crapola, I lost it. It was a good one too. What was it? It was after throwing up. Oh well, maybe it'll come back. But keep it from there, like that notion of a deeply physical experience that is associated with the inevitable and inescapable, let's say, unpleasantness. And I mean, unpleasantness is a tag for a word that means much worse than that. That is the inevitable consequence of passing through a portal associated with dealing with something that you have to deal with in order to be able to become healthy. But the journey to health is a dark night of the soul, right? To put it that way. Of course, we have these in many, many cases, like the one word you utter when you finally cross the portal of you are no longer going to be married, as you say that word to the person, that long path, right? That long path. Hey, we've been together 30 years. We kind of need to deal with this. You say that one word and the whole fucking universe pivots around you, and it's very unpleasant, right? And that future unpleasantness, guy, I think that's that load, like, you can feel all at once that whole unpleasantness right now. And it's sitting in front of you. You're feeling all of it. You're like, oh man, do I want to go across? Do I want to take that on?
Yeah.
I live with that with Meniere's. Disorientation is nauseating. I would rather have extreme. I know this. I've been in pain that is associated with me approaching the possibility of death. And I would take that over a Meniere's disorientation event any day of the week. If I was in the middle of a Meniere's and you said, you can get out of this completely, and all you have to pay for this is extreme pain in your chest that causes a fear of death, I'll go, give it to me. I want it. The nausea of disorientation, le nausée, Sartre, right, is just, it's profound. I think that image is, I think bringing the visceral in is very important here.
Yeah, it's dreadful. Like the thing that I associate, like that feeling of throwing up, like back up 5 minutes. That's the worst moment for me.
Yeah.
Right? Back up 10 minutes. You're lying in your bed and you feel it and you just know it's coming. And part of you is like, no, it's fine. I can stave it off. I got it together. And then this inkling grows and grows and grows that no, this is involuntary. And no amount of will is going to keep it at bay. And I think you materializing it into this metaphor, Jordan, is really helpful because it brings to mind that one of the things that the aporia does is it forces the forfeiture of will in some sense. And along with it, the forfeiture of ego, I guess, to bring Jung back into the mix just offhandedly, is that like, there's this moment, and I'm thinking of it as a moment you have with someone. And let's say it's a relationship of some real gravity. It's like there's a conversation that needs to happen. And I know, and I'm dreading it, and I'm dreading it. And I know that the only way for this relationship to go is on the other side of that conversation. That's the kairos. But timing is everything. And there's a moment when all of my instincts to maintain and restrain and maintain the control of that relationship have to be completely surrendered to that dreadful moment when all is given up for the fatality of whatever happens on the other side of it. So and it's that moment that I'm leading to, and my salvation or my horror is on the other side of it. Just like relief is on the other side of throwing up, or death, I suppose.
And you on the other side of that you can't really know and account for, other than maybe it's
an LA Paul transformative experience. You can't know what it's going to be like until you go through it. And like Jordan said, it's a one-way trip. You can't sort of step into it and, let's try vomiting for a bit and then back out of it. It doesn't work that way.
And we can tease apart the two yous. And I think Chris called one to the foreground, which is the ego you, which it's precisely the ego you and its need and desire to control the navigation and the kind of cultivate and protect the other, the deeper you. And it's the ego you stepping into the particular portal saying, now is the moment where I'm actually going away. I'm letting go. We're dropping into the kairos. We're now in living space where what happens, and it's beyond my capacity to navigate. And then you're in it, right? So you've got that's the horror, right? So you've got the dread and you've got the horror, and the horror of the ego you is the actual recognition that it is going to be going away, and whatever comes back on the other end is completely out of its control, which is the essence of the thing that it fears most.
That's to be born again. So, I mean, this is very appropriate because people compared talking to Socrates like being stung by a stingray. And that is I'm going to use this word because I want to play with it. That is an intoxicating experience. And then and of course, there's a connection between spirit and spirituality. And I'm wondering if there's a virtue and virtuosity about being intoxicated, but not so much that you have to be carried every time into the vomitorious, right? Because I mean, I don't want to deny in any way the dark night of the soul, but I think people in these practices have aporias that are not quite at that level, but they're nevertheless important to them. And I want to appreciate that. And I'm trying to get this notion. Well, there's intoxication that makes you vomit, and that can be a profound kind of intoxication. You see it in, ayahuasca and stuff like that. But there's also the intoxication that releases the Dionysian, or the intoxication, etc. Right? And I'm wondering then if there's a virtuosity virtue about titrating the toxication so that people can play with coming towards what we're talking about, but they don't have to every single time undergo profound ego death, because that's like getting thrown out of an airplane every 5 minutes, right? And that's
right? I think the answer is no. You're stuck. But let me soften the blow a bit. I've been stung by stingrays more than once, and the third time isn't as bad as the first time.
Yep. Yeah.
And when a 3 or 4 year old gets stung by a bee, that's a serious situation. It's still the same bee when it stings me, but it's not quite the same. To put it slightly more personally, one of the other concepts that came up for me was grief and weeping. Right, that when you kind of let go of the holding of the tightness of your heart to allow the grief to flow, and the weeping takes over. Right, this is exactly the same kind of thing. It's now you're in a tumult that has got its own arc, and you're just going to be in it until it sort of flows through you. And it's an unpleasantness that is a necessity associated with healing. I know people who are good at that. I know people who are able to notice the necessity.
Yes.
Who can flow into grief and can throw into true, like not simulated, real weeping and grief, and allow it to just kind of flow through them in a way that, for example, I cannot. So I dread the thing largely because of my, what would it be? Well, maturity is a word that comes up for sure. Like a lack of maturity in relationship with the suffering. And suffering, I hear, mean to undergo, like the undergoing of that.
Yeah, loss of agency. Yeah.
So to become more mature, but I don't think there's a soft path of becoming more mature. No matter what, there's always going to be a first time, and that first time is going to be big.
Well, I mean, to your point, to sort of go back to the metaphor of the intoxicant, like, frankly, I mean, you only know your limits. You only know how to drink well when you've had a few hangovers, or a few more, after that. And you learn how to harness the spirit of potential in that exercise only by having, desecrated it many times before, and you gradually earn the wisdom required to put that in service of what it can serve.
Wisdom, right?
There's wisdom. Yeah.
I was thinking, Guy, that's a way of describing how exposure becomes vulnerability in the way that you've been talking about. At first, we just get exposed to the intoxicant.
And the difference is like I voluntarily step into the intoxicant heaven releasing possibility. It has to do with right exposures. I
get thrown,
right? Like, but then I can go, well, it's not all bad over there. Actually, I ended up like a lot better off after all of that. Like, I still want to go over there. All right, but let's go for, and you step into it. It's a completely different thing. It's like genuine ability because there's volunteerness there. Yeah,
but there's also something that what Chris said, like when the exposure like Hegel talked about, you only know a limit if you exceed it, right? Which is right, and which is one of his deepest criticisms of Kant, that people have not deeply enough appreciated. And so, I was thinking of exposure as when you're just dragged beyond the limit and you're vomiting, that's literally you going beyond the limit, right? But then vulnerability is, there's something in what Jordan was saying, is like it's not like you make the nastiness go away, but you can absorb it better into your system. Like the third stingray sting isn't as bad as the first, and the third bee sting isn't as bad as the first. talking about normal bee stings. Some people it goes the opposite, but we'll put that aside. Like there's something like I think we're coming against the nub. There's some kind of change that's going on here, and Chris is right. It's outside will, but it's not just. We're not just. The difference is, I think you're saying that we're not just passively acquiescing in it either. There's I don't want to say we built up a resistance. That's the wrong term, but but Jordan, you were putting your finger on something viscerally. There's something that like it's like the way we acclimatize isn't the right word either, but we build up some ability to process it without having to be completely destroyed by it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't want to get drunk multiple times where you're vomiting and passing out, because if you do that multiple times, you're dead, right? You do it once or twice and you go, oh, okay. And now I can gauge. And then what I can do is, like Chris said, I can approach the horizon of horror just enough to wake me up, but not enough that I die.
Well,
it's really good to be hit in when you're sparring in martial arts. It's really good to be hit because and it's not because it's a pleasant experience. It's one of the most unpleasant experiences. You're knocked on your ass. You're disoriented. You're you feel totally shamed, right? But the thing is, part of you goes, well, I'm still here. Right? Right? You get a sense of resources available to you.
It's a real question. Is that, well, I'm still here? Is that I'm still here part, is that the vertical? Is that sense of the horizon?
That's what Stone talks about it when he talks about minimal transcendence. He talks about a sense of tapping into resources that are trans-egoic and that don't just arrive from your sort of an incremental extension of your abilities. Like you get a sense of you've tapped into resources that are outside the ego's authorship and authority.
So that I am still here in some sense it's the verticality shining.
Yes.
that gathers my spirits to organize to actually maybe make a decision to go towards it, right?
And I think people use both metaphors. I think people sometimes feel a welling up and they also feel a grace descending. And I don't think we should privilege either one of those directions. I think it's both in a profound way.
Yeah. I just hearing in that, just this sense of even through this, the horizontal and the vertical, coming together, even in that, and this renewing of them coming together, right, at every point, right? In
yes.
Yeah. And that's why, one thing that's so interesting to me is about how the vertical goes back and resituates the horizontal, right? Because you think, you spend all of this time tripping over yourself, having to err and fail and get way too drunk and throw up all of these times. And then you get a handle on it and you manage it. And suddenly you have this grace and equilibrium. It's not perfect, but it has a sense, there's a kind of finite transcendence to it.
Yes.
John, I think you'll agree, right? Because what happens is now you know how to get close enough, proximally, as you said, John, to the fire, know just how close you can get to the fire because of how finite you are. But being so close to the fire and being able to tolerate the exposure equips you to participate in the forces that are well beyond you and beyond your control.
Oh, that's
and
beautiful.
Getting to a point where you can do that, all of a sudden you relate to your own history. You relate to your own autobiography differently, having attained a measure of that, because then you can look back at your own autobiography and now you see this gulf between the one who can stand that close to the fire and the one who was scorched. And I think that gap then becomes a different way that the horizontal relates back to the vertical.
That's
because
brilliant.
all of a sudden the horizontal is not just
plotting. It's not just plotting. It's dancing.
Right.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. Like it's in dancing, right? Or like when you were always doing that. You're trying to get close to the fire without getting consumed by the fire. Yes.
There's also that quality of like insight. If we say insight is the moment where like the vertical kind of breaks through.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Thing where you realize something has always been true and it's been right in front of you, but it's been concealed the whole time. And then the next move is you go back to the very beginning of your life and you repopulate, right, your whole history with now seeing this as true, and you end up with you could say a more vertically infused past in some sense.
So this is really calling the Sufi tradition to my mind. And their constant use of drunkenness and intoxication as a way of talking about the finite, how their finitude is bound in love to the transcendence of God, the vertical, but how this makes them appear to, in history. They appear drunk, or Plato, the sage that returns to the cave, appears disoriented, even though they're not. Like there's something here about people who can do what Chris said, who can dance to the edge of the fire so they're aglow with it, like Moses when he comes back from Mount Sinai and he's glowing with God, but he's not God, right? Right? People who can do that, they would be in some ways disorienting for people who are still not capable of dancing so close to the fire. I mean, and this is something you see in the Sufi tradition. You see it, of course, in the koan. It's all over the Zen tradition like crazy. You see it in Jesus of Nazareth, well, of course, completely. And of course, Socrates.
It's also Socrates, the moment before his death.
Yeah, very much.
Ooh. Right, because the ultimate fire is death itself.
Of course.
So to have grown capable of walking close to that fire, to be able to step into that, which is the last possible crucible, with this level of equanimity, is disorientation, qua disorientation.
Yeah. Right, and apprehending and appreciating your mortality is to keep the finite and the transcendent bound together. Because if you only have the finite, you don't have the transcendent ability. You're just an animal. You're just subject to death, but you have no awareness of mortality. And if you just have the transcendence, you think yourself a god, and you are pretending that you are not fundamentally a mortal being. I think that ability is to bind the finite and the transcendent deeply together.
And that's why the will isn't annihilated. The will doesn't disappear. The will simply assents, right? It's like Socrates says yes to death. He doesn't will it, but he retains the agency to say yes. And that's all the will has to do at that point in time, when he's that close to the fire, is to just say yes.
I'm present to something that really struck me. By the way, John, thanks for that Rosen book and your commentary around that thing. I feel like reading that just like it cleaned something up, right, without really considering what was being cleaned, because it was sore after reading it. I'm like,
he takes on Heidegger, but he takes on Heidegger from a profound respect and knowledge and understanding of Heidegger. It's the best critique of Heidegger and Wittgenstein I've seen. And the way he weaves that into an analysis of the philosophical generation of nihilism as distinct from the experience of meaninglessness, I think it's profound. It's a profound book.
I didn't realize how much Plato into Heidegger, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One thing I wanted to I think that this is kind of touching on, right, about this, what I'm kind of getting from what we're saying here is this continual bringing together the vertical, the horizontal, the transcendent and the immanent, right? That they're mutually penetrating all the way up and all the way down. They're not, in other words, like opposed. Okay, and after he gets done breaking down Heidegger, he goes into talking about the good, and he said something about. I want to ask you, right? He says something about like it has to do with how Plato is able to get at all of this, right? And therefore sidestep nihilism or not be nihilistic, right? It's where they start talking, right, about. And he said it's that when it's not like looking at the future, right, and it's not looking at the past, right, it's not it's they start with talking about in the polis your opinions. And then he goes on as that like he goes on and describes I may butcher this, but correct me here, where he talks about that human beings are this kind of paradox, right, where we sit between speech and desire, and that the difficulty has to do with, right, that we need speech in order to have our desires, right? Like it's our speech that help us actually kind of articulate something out in the world, right? And so it's the whole thing about wisdom is desiring the right thing. But ultimately, the telos of all of our desires, right, is we all want perfection. We can't not. It's at the bottom of desire. But if we realize that part of our nature and we get the whole thing, then we've just eliminated ourselves we've eliminated ourselves. Like we're annihilated, right? But if we drop out the desire and just go all speech, right, then we've eliminated desire and everything goes into coherence. So he says this thing that's just really I've been thinking about, and I'm feeling this tautness, right, in what we're talking about, where he says the job here and what philosophy is innately trying to do on some level, right, is to bring our speech and our desires into a whole relationship such that we can get as close as possible to the ultimate horizon, what we want, that in a way that still affords us as being speakers at the same time, right? Like there's this, and I got this paradox of being a human being, and in the way that he situates, like had you show, it's like this is how you want the proper. And I think I texted you this, John. The proper closeness that holds at a distance, right? The good, basically.
Yeah.
And that why it's so hard is because we want to go fully into the other one and exclude the other one. Boom. But in both cases, we eliminate it. But that not being nihilistic is the hardest thing, right? Because having to situate yourself with what you most want is what you need to hold at bay in order to speak about it and to have this. So I'm just kind of.
But that's it.
Yeah,
I think this is what what Chris was talking about dancing the fire, right? So how I understand Rosen, he talks about wisdom is the attempt to give complete speech, complete logos, where complete logos is a complete interpenetration of dianoia, which proposes and abstracts, and noesis, which is the desire for unity. So all desire is the desire for unity, and unity removes distance, right? And so desire is trying to close the distance, and logos has to differentiate and articulate, open up the space. But then the problem with that is we can get abstraction, and then we get what, and this is what Rusin talks about in development, we get abstraction, and then we're disconnected from the flow, right? And so, right, what we're getting, what the good is the good. There's also the through line through the forms he's talking about, but I won't do that part of it. But what I like is he integrates that with the good is that which is constantly calling us to resituate ourselves in the finite transcendence. Like, so what it's doing is it's constantly calling us, right, to this, right, apophatic, cataphatic, noetic, dianoetic thing, because either one of them ends our humanity. If we do this, we lose speech, right? If there's nothing to which we are conforming, then our speech degenerates into noise. It's the purely horizontal. If we do this and we go purely vertical, we get the complete unity the henosis, and we fall into the ineffability of the one, and we lose all intelligibility and speech. And he said either one of the, Rosen's argument is, Plato is trying, and this lines up with Hyland, right? What Plato is trying to do is constantly, like, you're called to the sun, but you won't touch the sun, and then you go back into the cave, right? It's Plato is constantly trying to get us to dance towards the edge of the fire, because that's where intelligibility is. That's what, and that sort of, not polarizing, that polarity, that field that constantly keeps us dancing, that's the good.
Yeah.
And that's how it's a fount of intelligibility for us. So it's not only a fount of intelligibility in the through line from all the aspects, and that's in Rosen, by the way. The convergence with that my work there is clear, but he's also got this existential dimension to the good. The good is what puts us between between silent desire, the unity, and you know, the unfold. So there's the constant infolding and unfolding, and either one of those, untethered from the other, gives us nihilism. But the good is trying to keep us constantly, it's what it creates the force field around us, so we're always in the polarity, and we don't get trapped in either one of the poles. Did that answer your question, Guy?
I just wanted you to say all that.
But for me, that's a brilliant proposal, because I have been concentrating so much on the, and I don't think unreasonably, on the epistemic side, the phenomenological, the disclosure, the alethetic side of the good. Well, the good is the through line, but Rosen also brings out this existential, you know, but the good is also that which most fundamentally continually reorients you, so you can dance on the edge of the fire in finite transcendence and most properly be immortal.
Yeah. Yes.
All of philosophy is the preparation for death.
Yes. Yes.
I was feeling the being hit in sparring, and I was noticing the relationship between that and the fact that as evolved beings, evolution pushes the limit by nature, right? So we actually can't really learn unless we are playing right at the edge of death.
Criticality.
Criticality, exactly.
Criticality is where everything is optimized. Criticality is where everything is optimized. And criticality is not only fundamental to the grammar of cognition, it's fundamental to the grammar of reality. It is that which puts us most deeply in conformity with being itself.
And you know, it makes sense when we remember that one of the things that we've lost amidst the many things that we've lost is a proper relationship to death.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you were saying before, Jordan, that there's this incredible grace in being able to grieve properly, there's a certain relationship to death that produces graceful grief, the kind of grief that edifies, that relinquishes properly, maintains properly, draws the balance that John is describing, the eros drawn to unity and the logos of differentiation. And there's something about, it seems to me, wise grief in the face of death and loss that somehow manages to do that. And that brings a question to my mind for all three of you is, you know, grief and agape seem to me to be, I don't know if they're coterminous, but they're deeply, deeply related. Mm-hmm. So if the good that allows us to dance before the fire is combined with the eros that draws us closer to it in hunger, and the logos that keeps us wisely apart from it with an arm outstretched in caution, what then is the role of agape?
Well, one of the things that I felt when you brought up grief, right, was this way that the grieving process in some way is this, it's this kind of almost this innate, deep, natural de-idolatrizing something, right?
Oh, that's good. That's good.
right? Which is, I'm married to you, or I have this thing and it's been there my whole life. And I have all these qualities of being that my mind is fused with this person, this thing. And then that person goes away. And because it's fused, like you could say the grief, this is why it's not sadness. It's like basically at first you feel like I'm never going to feel love ever again for the rest of my life. I will never feel that kind of closeness that we shared because they're fused in your mind. But then you cry and you go through the process and the denial and the anger and all of that stuff. If that happens, at some point, that process kind of leads into this place where, okay, love itself and the image of this person start to become distinguished, right? And so when you start to break into this acceptance, it's because you've no longer are like having idolatry with that person. You've reclaimed being in being's place, right? And there's something seems like if we just follow that up from like if we look at that angle, right, and then we look at agapic love of what's happening, I think we'll find something interesting.
We found something interesting already.
Oh yeah.
So I wanna add a dimension. I don't think this is pushback, but part of what I've seen in grief is it's actually not lying to you when it says to you, you will never love this way again, because you won't. And in fact, if you try, this is the classic rebound mistake. If you try to replicate what you had, then you're screwed.
Yeah.
Or but on the other hand, if you just deify like I know people that don't properly grieve because they start to deify the dead person. And they become a sainted figure, and it's bullshit, right? And then they can't ever. So I see again, there's a tension here. There's a tension between, like you said, grief is telling us, okay, they weren't a god.
Mm-hmm.
But I think grief is also asking us to recognize, yeah, but there is something you're never going to get back. You're facing irrecoverable loss, no matter what. You can fall in love again, and you will.
Yes.
And in that sense, your grief is telling you a lie, but grief is telling you the truth. You will never love that way again, right? And it's trying to get you between those two, right? That's what I'm hearing. And to me, agape is both of those. Agape is, right, you are trying to nurture the suchness of this person, like their specific, unique mystery, right? But you're not deifying them. And I've met parents that deify their kids, and that's a disaster. And then I've met parents who treat their kids like a project, and they treat their kids categorical. Well, I've done this with my 7 children. Here's the age, and this is what I do, and here's the plan. We're at stage 7B, paragraph E. Like, and I've met both of those, and it's been my general observation that neither one of these is a particularly good strategy for parenting, right? They both are disastrous. There's something about how do we have due reverence for the irreplaceability, the mystery of what we are bringing into being, without turning it into a god.
Yes.
And I think grief and agape are wrapped up in that way with each other. And I mean, we have to think about the opposite of grief. Grief, I think joy is when we have that, when we deeply participate agapically in something and we just want to celebrate its existence, but we are not worshiping it as a god, right? And I think, like, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean for me to have joy with Sarah, and the fact that it is making me vulnerable, and I'm using that term very deliberately given Guy's distinction. It's making me vulnerable to future grief. And there's part of me that does what Chris says. Part of me says, my will can't change that reality, but I can assent to it rather than just merely be the victim of it. I can say, I choose the future grief because I choose the joy because I feel a reverence and responsibility for how agape binds me to the irreplaceable mystery without making me treat the person as anything but a mortal.
And that
Because if I could treat them as a god, I'll never face grief. If they're a god, I'll never face grief.
is it fair to say that that mystery is the one thing you can't lose?
Well, what do you mean? I mean, I can and I have. I mean, every person is an absolutely unique doorway to the universe that is closed when they die, and you can never go through that door again. You can find other doorways that disclose things that are profound and about the universe's mystery.
Yeah.
But what I find, like I tell people, first of all, you never talk when somebody's in the depths of grief. You just be with them. But I tell people, don't try and close the hole. That aperture can't be closed. You have to. Yes. You have to grow around it.
I just want to clarify it. So I think we're saying the same thing, but we maybe like there's two things kind of I want to uncollapse. Right? Is one, I think yes, the grief definitely is saying this person's gone. You will never have the love with this person, right? Again, I think one of the things I was highlighting is that, but at first, right, like the grief has things like what's fused is
there's confusion. There's confusion. Yes,
self is never going to be there again, right? And that's it's the fusion, and so the grief process, if you let yourself go through it, is the process of unfusing the face from the idea, right?
But that's just because we don't practice, like Chris said, we don't do premeditatio the way the Stoics or the Buddhists did. We don't practice grief ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
If we do, they don't have to be confused. I'm saying it's not inevitable that they have to be confused. That is a psychological consequence of our lack of skill and our ignorance.
Yes.
See, this is where the dimensions come back together. What I'm hearing is that, successful grief, it's a weird way of putting it, wise grief, edifying grief, converts the person whom we grieve from an idol into a symbol.
An icon.
An icon.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that we see them and by means of them at the same time, right? The translucency of the symbolic. So
right.
Our love is not forever inextricably bound up with that person and dies with them. However, they and their likeness becomes a way of re-invoking our connection to the very love that they once stood for, made possible, and now will always be making possible in perpetuity. And that's why the vertical affordance, the vertical affordance for the love itself gets resituated into the horizontal, the historical relationship we had with that person, which is now always going to be a feature of who we are as characters.
Right.
So the grief is a way of binding the vertical and the historical together, the vertical and the horizontal together by means of the symbolization of that which was once an idol. Being it by means of it.
Okay. Can I take this one?
Yeah, please. Keep bubbling.
So so just to hold a little bit the metaphor or the particular example of food poisoning and the language of processing or healing or suffering as the way of is the experience of undergoing the process whereby we metabolize a particular experience so as to heal and grow through it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then we have grief is that, right? That's the argument I'm making is grief is just that. So when, for example, a loved one dies, this is one of the most momentous possibilities for our own metabolizing and growing that is available in the human experience, right? The greatest gift that anyone can give is to die for their friends. I don't mean that just in the sense of to sacrifice for the purpose of their friends having a better situation, but actually the giving of your life is an unlocking or an unleashing of an experiential, non-deniable, existential potency that is metabolized by the other that allows them to grow in a way that cannot otherwise be accessed. It is only by experiencing the death of your own father that you are able to go through a portal of growth that is part of the natural arc of being a human. That's the only possible way that can happen in the universe. And so that is the last and final greatest gift that individual could possibly give to their children, right? And grief is literally the name that we call that experience. That's the experience we're having. That's the name that we give it. Joy is the emergence of that which will be giving us grief in the future as it is coming into being in the first place. So the birth of a child has the feeling of joy, right? We feel this momentous possibility emerging into earth, right? Joy is the name that we give to possibilities it's beginning to actualize. And grief is the name that we give when actuality is giving itself back for the resurgence of possibility, for the purpose of nurturing and giving rise to the growth of that which is.
One of the wisest people in my life, when I was experiencing a profound grief, he said to me, he said, John, don't ever get in a deep relationship with somebody who hasn't experienced grief. And it took me years to get the wisdom of that, because people who have not experienced deep grief, they lack a dimension to their humanity that will spring forth, will come to fruition in really difficult way. It's similar. It's not the same, but it's similar to, don't get in a romantic relationship if you have kids with somebody who's never had kids, because they won't get it. They can't get it. Oh, I love kids. That's not the same as having a child. I'm sorry, it's just not the same, right? I think that was that. Yeah, that really landed very deeply and personally for me, what you said, Jordan.
Yeah.
That's, remember, you and I shared that story about the Buddha and the woman who wanted her son resurrected, and that whole story. There's something about the way grief, like in a tragedy, the way the grief binds like Chris is saying, it binds the transcendent and the temporal so profoundly together.
Yes.
Right.
I'm hearing like this, like as I keep circling around to this sense of like the verticality of time and the
horizontality of time, you mean, and the verticality of eternity. Yeah.
Eternity as this way where I keep feeling like it, and it feels healing to me, of like there's a resolution, like something sighs of like, oh, there's eternity like unfolding in time, and they're both doing this, and it's having me have this kind of really, really healing experience that I feel under.
Well, that's what tragedy should do. And tragedy is not history, and tragedy is not contemplation. But I think one of the band members has to leave for other obligations, and so and of course we never complete Dialogos. We just abandon it because we've gone as far as we can under the circumstances. Finite transcendence, right? We've transcended as much as we can within the finite limits. So I just want to thank everybody, and I'm glad we did this, and we should think about doing this again fairly soon. I think, like I said, the spontaneous Dialogos complements the dialectic into Dialogos, and having both exemplified for people, I think, is really valuable, not only for the content that is produced, but just because the way it exemplifies something of well, Socrates said, this is what makes life ultimately worth living, right? This ability to do this kind of interaction. So I just wanted to thank everybody. I know this is on Guy's channel, but I just wanted to make a space for Jordan to leave.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jordan.
I'll start another thread. We'll schedule another one.
I'm gonna hop off too. This has been wonderful.